Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands with an old rag as she stepped out of the garage. The desert sun beat down on the small town of Cedar Ridge, Arizona, where the annual motorcycle rally drew riders from across the Southwest. She had volunteered to help at Murphy's Garage, the only repair shop willing to stay open late during rally weekend to help stranded bikers. The sound of rumbling engines filled the air as dozens of motorcycles lined the main street. Sarah watched the parade of leather-clad riders with genuine appreciation. She understood the appeal of powerful machines and the freedom they represented. After all, she worked with much more complex machinery in her day job, though none of these bikers would ever guess that by looking at her. At 28, Sarah stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore simple jeans and a plain t-shirt, nothing that would draw attention. Her hands, though small, bore the calluses and small scars that came from working with tools and machinery. Most people saw a quiet young woman who seemed out of place among the chrome and leather crowd. "Hey, Murphy," a loud voice called from the street. "You got anyone who actually knows motorcycles working in there?" Sarah looked up to see a tall man in his 40s dismounting from a massive Harley-Davidson. His leather vest displayed patches from various motorcycle clubs, and his arms were covered in tattoos. A thick gray beard covered his weathered face, and his gut strained against his black t-shirt. He walked with the swagger of someone used to being the biggest, loudest person in any room. Murphy emerged from under the hood of a broken-down Kawasaki, grease staining his coveralls. "What's the problem, Tank?" The big biker, apparently called Tank, gestured dismissively toward his motorcycle. "Engine's making a weird noise. Been happening for about 50 miles. I need someone who knows what they're doing to take a look." "Sarah here is pretty good with engines," Murphy said, nodding toward her. "She's been helping out all weekend." Tank looked Sarah up and down with obvious skepticism. A smirk spread across his face as he shook his head. "No offense, sweetheart, but I need a real mechanic. This bike is worth more than most people's cars. I'm not letting some amateur mess around with it." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with this attitude her entire career. "What kind of noise is it making?" she asked calmly. Tank laughed, a harsh sound that carried over the rumble of passing motorcycles. "Listen, honey, why don't you go get me a beer or something? Let the men handle the machinery." Several other bikers had gathered around, drawn by Tank's loud voice. Some chuckled at his dismissive comment, while others looked uncomfortable. Sarah noticed a few women in the group rolling their eyes at Tank's behavior. "I'm happy to take a look," Sarah persisted. "Murphy can supervise if you're concerned." "Supervise what?" Tank spread his arms wide, playing to his audience. "You probably don't even know the difference between a V-twin and an inline-4. Hell, I bet you can't even change your own oil." The crowd grew larger as Tank's voice carried down the street. Sarah realized she was becoming the center of unwanted attention. Part of her wanted to walk away and let Tank figure out his own problems. But another part of her, the part that had refused to be intimidated by drill sergeants and commanding officers, decided she had heard enough. "Actually," Sarah said, stepping closer to Tank's motorcycle, "based on the sound I heard when you pulled up, I'd guess you're dealing with a failing cam chain tensioner. It's a common problem on that model year, especially if you've been riding hard in desert heat." Tank's smirk faltered slightly. "Lucky guess." Sarah crouched down next to the bike, listening carefully to the engine idle. She pointed to a specific area of the engine. "The clicking sound is coming from right here. It's not constant, which means the tensioner is starting to fail but hasn't completely given out yet. If you keep riding without fixing it, you'll be looking at much more expensive damage." "Anyone can make up technical-sounding stuff," Tank said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Murphy stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. "Sarah really does know her stuff, Tank. She diagnosed that Ducati problem yesterday that had me stumped for 2 hours." Tank glanced around at the watching crowd, clearly not wanting to back down in front of his peers. "Tell you what, little lady, if you're so confident, why don't we make this interesting? You think you can fix my bike faster than I can fix yours?" "I don't have a bike here," Sarah replied. Tank's grin returned. "Even better. Pick any broken bike in Murphy's lot. If you can get it running before I finish my own repairs, I'll admit you know what you're doing. But when you fail, you owe me an apology and a beer." Sarah looked over at Murphy's collection of abandoned motorcycles, waiting for parts or their owners to claim them. Most had been sitting for months. Several people in the crowd were already taking bets on the outcome. What do I get when I win? Sarah asked. Tank laughed. Honey, you're not going to win. But sure, if by some miracle you do, I'll fix your car for free anytime you need it. Deal? Sarah studied Tank's face, seeing the absolute certainty there. He genuinely believed there was no way she could succeed. That level of overconfidence had always been the downfall of men like him. Deal, she said, extending her hand. Tank's large hand engulfed hers in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating grip. Sarah didn't flinch, meeting his gaze steadily. She had shaken hands with generals and had her work evaluated by some of the most demanding technical experts in the military. One loud biker wasn't going to rattle her. As the crowd dispersed to give them working room, Sarah walked over to examine the abandoned motorcycles. She selected a Honda that had been sitting for at least 3 months, its engine seized from neglect. It would be a challenge, but she had faced much worse under considerably more pressure. Tank was already working on his cam chain tensioner, confident in his abilities and certain of his victory. He had no idea that the quiet woman working a few feet away spent her days maintaining and repairing some of the most sophisticated military aircraft ever built. The Honda motorcycle Sarah had chosen looked like it had seen better days. Rust stained the exhaust pipes and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. The owner had brought it in months ago complaining that it wouldn't start, then disappeared without paying for repairs. Murphy had given up on it weeks ago. Sarah circled the bike slowly, her trained eyes cataloging every visible problem. The battery was certainly dead. The fuel had probably turned to varnish, and the engine showed signs of water damage from sitting outside during Arizona's rare but intense rainstorms. Most mechanics would have declared it a total loss, but Sarah saw challenges like this differently than most people. In her regular job, she routinely brought million-dollar aircraft back from the edge of catastrophic failure. A broken motorcycle was almost relaxing by comparison. "You sure you want that piece of junk?" Tank called from across the garage. He had his Harley's engine cover off and was already working on the cam chain tensioner. "I could probably get 3 of these running in the time it takes you to figure out which end of a wrench to hold." Sarah ignored the comment and began gathering tools. She moved with efficient purpose, selecting exactly what she needed without wasted motion. Her movements caught the attention of Murphy, who had worked with enough mechanics over the years to recognize real expertise when he saw it. Several spectators had returned to watch the competition unfold. Word had spread through the rally about the bet between Tank and the quiet young woman. Money was changing hands as bikers placed bets on the outcome, with odds heavily favoring Tank. "My money's on the big guy," announced a woman with silver hair and multiple piercings. "He's been working on bikes since before that girl was born." "Don't be so sure," replied an older man leaning against a restored Indian motorcycle. "Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you." Sarah started with the basics, checking the electrical system first. She pulled the spark plugs, which were corroded beyond repair, and set them aside. The air filter was clogged with debris and would need complete replacement. But these were simple problems with simple solutions. Tank glanced over occasionally, his confidence growing as he watched Sarah remove part after part from the Honda. To him, it looked like she was taking the bike apart rather than fixing it. He had already identified his problem and was making steady progress. "You know, there's no shame in giving up," Tank called out. "That bike's been dead for months." Even Murphy couldn't get it running. "I'm just getting started," Sarah replied without looking up. She pulled the fuel tank and drained the old gasoline, which came out looking more like syrup than fuel. The fuel lines would need flushing, and the carburetor would require complete cleaning. But again, these were problems she had dealt with countless times, just on a much smaller scale than her usual work. As Sarah worked, a small crowd gathered to watch. Her methodical approach impressed some of the more experienced mechanics in the group. She didn't waste time on unnecessary steps or show off with flashy techniques. Every movement served a purpose. Tank finished replacing his cam chain tensioner and fired up his Harley. The engine ran smoothly, the problematic clicking sound completely gone. He revved the engine several times, grinning at the perfect sound. "All done," he announced loudly. "Hope you brought that beer money, sweetheart." But when Tank looked over at Sarah's work area, his confidence wavered slightly. The Honda was completely disassembled, but Sarah was cleaning and rebuilding each component with precision that surprised him. Her hands moved with the sure confidence of someone who had done this type of work many times before. "She's actually pretty good with those tools," admitted one of Tank's buddies. a thin man with arms covered in motorcycle tattoos. Anyone can take stuff apart, Tank replied, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Let's see if she can put it back together. Sarah began reassembling the engine, her movements becoming faster as she warmed to the task. She had memorized the location of every bolt and connector during disassembly. This was a skill that had served her well in her military career, where quick, accurate repairs often meant the difference between mission success and failure. The carburetor came next. Completely rebuilt with parts Murphy had in stock, Sarah had found several internal components that were corroded or damaged, problems that wouldn't have been obvious without complete disassembly. She replaced gaskets, cleaned jets, and adjusted the float level with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Tank tried to maintain his confident demeanor, but privately, he was becoming concerned. Sarah's work was far more thorough than he had expected, and her skill level was obviously much higher than he had assumed. She moved around the motorcycle like someone who understood not just how the parts fit together, but why they were designed that way. Maybe I underestimated her a little, Tank admitted quietly to his friend. A little? His buddy replied. Look at her go. She's like a machine herself. Sarah installed a new battery and filled the tank with fresh gasoline. She checked the timing, adjusted the valve clearances, and verified that all electrical connections were secure. Everything was proceeding exactly as she had planned. The crowd around both workstations had grown considerably. Word of the competition had spread throughout the rally, and bikers were streaming into Murphy's garage to witness the outcome. The betting had become more complex, with side wagers on timing and whether Sarah's bike would actually run. Tank checked his watch nervously. He had finished his repair 45 minutes ago, but Sarah showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, she seemed to be gaining momentum as the end approached. How much longer do you need? Tank called out, trying to sound casual. Almost finished, Sarah replied, installing the final engine cover. Tank's earlier swagger had completely disappeared. He watched Sarah's final preparations with growing anxiety, realizing that his assumption about her abilities might have been seriously wrong. The quiet young woman was demonstrating a level of mechanical expertise that impressed even the most experienced bikers in the crowd. Sarah stood up and wiped her hands on a clean rag. The Honda looked transformed, clean, and properly assembled. But the real test was still to come. All her work would be meaningless if the engine didn't start. She looked over at Tank, who was trying to maintain his confident expression despite obvious nervousness. The entire garage had fallen silent, waiting for the moment of truth. Sarah approached the Honda with calm confidence, but inside her heart was beating faster. She had rebuilt the entire engine system, but old motorcycles could be unpredictable. Still, she had learned long ago to trust her training and experience, even when others doubted her abilities. The garage had become completely quiet except for the distant rumble of motorcycles on the street outside. More than 50 people had crowded into Murphy's workspace, creating a semicircle around Sarah and the Honda. The betting had reached several $100s, with most money still on Tank despite Sarah's impressive work. Go ahead, sweetheart, Tank said, his voice strained as he tried to maintain his cocky attitude. Fire her up and let's see what happens. Sarah straddled the motorcycle and checked the controls one final time. Fuel valve open, choke engaged, kill switch in the correct position. She took a deep breath and pressed the electric starter. The engine turned over slowly, struggling against months of neglect. Once, twice, 3 times without catching. Some people in the crowd began to murmur, and Sarah heard someone say, "Knew it was too good to be true." But Sarah remained calm. She adjusted the choke slightly and tried again. This time the engine coughed to life, running roughly for a few seconds before smoothing out into a steady purr. The crowd erupted in surprised cheers and applause. Tank's face went pale as the reality of his situation sank in. Not only had Sarah gotten the supposedly unfixable motorcycle running, but it sounded better than some of the bikes parked outside. The engine ran smoothly without missing or irregular noises. Well, I'll be damned, Murphy said, grinning widely. That bike hasn't run in 6 months. I was about to sell it for scrap. Sarah revved the engine gently, listening to its response. Everything sounded perfect. She had accomplished exactly what she set out to do, just as she had with countless more complex machines in her professional life. Lucky break, Tank muttered. But his heart wasn't in the dismissal. He was clearly shaken by Sarah's success. Luck had nothing to do with it, replied the older man with the Indian motorcycle. That was pure skill. I've been working on bikes for 30 years and I couldn't have done what she just did. Tank looked around at the crowd, realizing that his earlier mockery had backfired spectacularly. Several people were looking at him with obvious disappointment, particularly the women in the group who had witnessed his condescending comments. A deal's a deal, Sarah said, shutting off the Honda and climbing down. I believe you owe me some free car repairs. Tank nodded reluctantly, his earlier bluster completely gone. Yeah, you got me. I didn't think you could pull it off. Most people don't, Sarah replied quietly. As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached Sarah to congratulate her on the impressive repair. Several asked where she had learned such advanced mechanical skills, but Sarah deflected the questions with vague references to working with machinery. A woman in her 50s with short gray hair and keen eyes lingered after most others had left. She had been watching Sarah's work with particular interest, noting details that others had missed. That was extraordinary work, the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Janet Coleman. I teach automotive technology at the community college. Thank you, Sarah replied, shaking Janet's hand. I'm Sarah Martinez. Where did you learn to work like that? Janet asked. Your technique is unlike anything I see from civilian mechanics. Everything you did had a military precision to it. Sarah hesitated for a moment. She had become accustomed to keeping her military service private, especially around groups of strangers. Too many people had preconceived notions about women in the military, and she preferred to let her work speak for itself. I've had some technical training, Sarah said diplomatically. Janet studied Sarah's face carefully. I spent 12 years as a Navy mechanic before I started teaching. I recognize military training when I see it. What was your specialty? Aircraft maintenance, Sarah admitted reluctantly. What kind of aircraft? Sarah glanced around to make sure Tank and his friends were out of earshot. Helicopters, mostly. Janet's eyebrows rose. Combat helicopters? Among others. Tank had been eavesdropping from a few feet away, and despite his earlier defeat, his curiosity got the better of him. You worked on helicopters? Like real military helicopters? Sarah sighed, realizing her cover was beginning to slip. Yes, real helicopters. What kind? Tank pressed, his attitude shifting from defeated to genuinely interested. Sarah hesitated again, but Janet's encouraging nod convinced her to open up slightly. Various types. Transport, reconnaissance, attack helicopters. Tank's demeanor changed completely. His earlier hostility was replaced by something approaching respect. No kidding? My brother was a helicopter pilot in Iraq. He always said the maintenance crews were the real heroes, keeping those birds flying in impossible conditions. It's just a job, Sarah said modestly. Just a job? Janet laughed. Military helicopter maintenance is some of the most demanding technical work in the world. The precision required, the complexity of the systems, the pressure of knowing that lives depend on your work. No wonder you made rebuilding a motorcycle look easy. Word of Sarah's military background began to spread through the remaining crowd. Tank, despite his earlier behavior, found himself genuinely curious about her experiences. So you work on helicopters like the ones they show in movies? Tank asked. The big attack ones with missiles and guns? Sarah considered how much to reveal. I work on various aircraft in support of military operations. That's so cool, said a young man who had been watching the engine rebuild. I always wondered what those jobs were like. Tank scratched his beard thoughtfully. You know, I feel like even more of an idiot now. Here I was giving you grief about not knowing motorcycles, and you probably work on machines that cost more than my house. The principles are similar, Sarah said diplomatically. Internal combustion engines, electrical systems, hydraulic components. The scale is different, but the basic concepts are the same. Murphy returned from dealing with another customer and overheard the conversation. Hold on a minute. You're telling me our volunteer mechanic works on military helicopters. What kind specifically? Sarah realized there was no point in being evasive anymore. The truth was going to come out anyway, and these people deserved an honest answer after witnessing her work. Apache attack helicopters, among others, she said simply. The garage fell silent again as the full implications of Sarah's revelation sank in. Everyone present understood that Apache helicopters represented some of the most sophisticated military technology in the world, requiring extraordinary skill and training to maintain. Tank stared at Sarah for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Apache helicopters were legendary among military enthusiasts. These weren't just any aircraft. They were some of the most advanced and feared weapon systems ever created. Apache helicopters? Tank repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. You mean the ones with the 30mm chain gun and Hellfire missiles? Sarah nodded simply. Among other systems, yes. The remaining crowd exchanged glances of amazement. Janet Coleman whistled softly under her breath. Sarah, do you have any idea how impressive that is? Apache maintenance requires top-secret clearance and years of specialized training. There are maybe a few thousand people in the entire world qualified to do what you do. It's really not that unusual, Sarah said, uncomfortable with the attention. Lots of people serve in technical roles. Not like this, Tank said, shaking his head slowly. My brother used to tell me stories about Apache mechanics. He said they were like surgeons, except instead of operating on people, they were keeping $50 million war machines running in combat zones. Murphy laughed and slapped his forehead. And here I was worried about letting you work on motorcycles. Sarah, those Apaches have more computing power than mission control at NASA. The targeting systems alone probably cost more than everything in this garage combined. Sarah felt herself blushing. The technology is sophisticated, but the basic maintenance principles aren't that different from what we did here today. Troubleshooting, systematic diagnosis, careful assembly. It's all about understanding how systems work together. Tank was beginning to understand just how badly he had misjudged the situation. So when you were diagnosing my cam chain tensioner problem, that was probably like asking a brain surgeon to put on a bandage. Engine noise is engine noise, Sarah replied diplomatically. Whether it's a Harley-Davidson or a turboshaft engine, the diagnostic process is similar. Turboshaft engines? The young man asked. Those are jet engines, right? Sarah nodded. The Apache uses two General Electric T700 turboshaft engines. Each one produces about 1,700 horsepower and can push the aircraft to speeds over 180 miles per hour. Tank's jaw dropped. 1,700 horsepower? My Harley has maybe 80 horsepower, and I thought that was impressive. The engines are just one component, Sarah continued, warming to the subject despite herself. The Apache has integrated avionics, radar systems, infrared targeting, weapons control computers, navigation systems, communications equipment. Everything has to work perfectly together, and every system has multiple backups. Janet leaned forward with professional interest. How many different specialties does it take to maintain one of those aircraft? On a typical maintenance crew, you might have specialists in engines, hydraulics, electrical systems, avionics, weapons systems, and rotor components, Sarah explained. But everyone cross-trains to some degree. In combat situations, you can't always wait for the right specialist to be available. Tank was looking at Sarah with something approaching awe. So you're telling me you can fix jet engines, weapons, systems, and computers, but I thought you couldn't handle a simple motorcycle? The irony wasn't lost on me, Sarah admitted with a slight smile. Murphy shook his head in amazement. Sarah, I owe you an apology too. When you first showed up offering to help, I figured you were just another rally volunteer with basic mechanical knowledge. I had no idea I had a military aviation expert in my garage. You didn't need to know, Sarah replied. I just wanted to help out during the rally. Tank ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling with his earlier behavior. I feel like the biggest fool on the planet right now. Here you are, probably one of the most qualified mechanics in the state, and I'm treating you like you don't know which end of a wrench to hold. You weren't the first and you won't be the last, Sarah said matter-of-factly. People make assumptions based on appearances, it happens. But it shouldn't happen, Tank said firmly. I was completely out of line and I'm sorry, really sorry. The sincerity in Tank's voice was obvious to everyone present. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by genuine remorse and respect. Janet asked, How long have you been working on Apaches? About 6 years, Sarah replied. I started as a general aircraft mechanic and specialized after my first deployment. Deployment? Tank asked. You mean like in combat zones? Sarah nodded. Afghanistan mostly. Some other places I can't really discuss." The gravity of that statement settled over the group. They were talking to someone who had maintained combat aircraft under the most demanding conditions imaginable, where mechanical failure could mean the difference between life and death for American soldiers. Tank sat down heavily on a nearby workbench. "Sarah, I don't even know what to say. You've been in actual combat zones, keeping attack helicopters running while people are shooting at you, and I'm giving you attitude about motorcycles?" The shooting wasn't usually directed at the maintenance areas, Sarah said with dry humor, though it did add a certain urgency to our work. Murphy laughed nervously. "I can imagine. How do you even concentrate on precision work with all that going on?" "Training," Sarah said simply. "Lots and lots of training. When you've practiced something 10,000 times in controlled conditions, you can do it under stress too." Tank stood up and extended his hand to Sarah. "I owe you more than an apology. What you do, what you've done for our country, it deserves respect. Real respect, not the lip service I was giving earlier." Sarah shook his hand, surprised by the obvious emotion in Tank's voice. "I appreciate that, but I really was just trying to help with your motorcycle." "And you did help," Tank replied. "Better than anyone else could have. That tensioner diagnosis was spot on." Janet checked her watch and stood up reluctantly. "I hate to break this up, but I have a class to teach. Sarah, if you're ever interested in sharing your experiences with students, I'd love to have you speak at the college." "I'll think about it," Sarah replied. As Janet left, Tank turned back to Sarah with obvious curiosity. "Can I ask you something? What's it like working on those Apaches? I mean, what does a typical day look like for someone in your position?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Most of her work was classified, but there were aspects she could discuss without violating security protocols. "Every day is different," she began. "Some days it's routine maintenance, checking fluid levels, inspecting components, replacing parts that have reached their service life. Other days it's emergency repairs on aircraft that have taken battle damage or suffered mechanical failures." Tank listened intently, his earlier hostility completely replaced by genuine fascination. Tank pulled up a stool, clearly settling in for a longer conversation. The hostile biker who had mocked Sarah's abilities just hours earlier had been replaced by someone genuinely eager to learn about her extraordinary career. "Emergency repairs in combat zones," Tank repeated thoughtfully. "That must be incredibly stressful. I get nervous working on my own bike in my garage, and that's just for fun." Sarah leaned against the workbench, considering how much detail she could share. "The pressure is intense, but you learn to channel it productively. When a helicopter comes back with battle damage, there might be pilots waiting for that same aircraft to fly another mission. Lives literally depend on getting repairs done quickly and correctly." "What kind of battle damage are we talking about?" asked the young man who had remained to listen. "Small arms fire is common," Sarah explained. "Bullet holes in non-critical areas, damaged exterior components, sometimes hydraulic leaks from shrapnel. The Apache is heavily armored, but it's not invulnerable." Tank shook his head in amazement. "And you have to figure out how to fix that kind of damage in a combat zone without a full workshop?" "Field conditions require creative solutions," Sarah confirmed. "Sometimes you're working by flashlight or in extreme heat or while wearing full protective gear. You learn to improvise with whatever materials and tools are available." Murphy, who had been listening while organizing his tools, joined the conversation. "That explains why you made rebuilding that Honda look so easy. If you can repair battle-damaged helicopters in the desert, a motorcycle in an air-conditioned garage must feel like vacation." "It was actually relaxing," Sarah admitted with a smile. "No time pressure, no incoming mortars, unlimited clean water for washing parts. Luxury conditions compared to some places I've worked." Tank's expression grew serious. "Sarah, I hope you know how much we appreciate what you and people like you do." "I know I didn't show it earlier, but the military technical personnel who keep our equipment running, you're the unsung heroes." "It's just our job," Sarah replied, though she was clearly touched by Tank's words. "No, it's not just a job," Tank insisted. "My brother told me about a mission where their Apache developed engine problems over enemy territory. The maintenance crew worked for 18 straight hours to get it mission ready again, because intelligence said American soldiers were counting on air support the next morning." Sarah nodded. "Those situations happen more often than most people realize. Aircraft maintenance in combat zones isn't just about following technical manuals. You're directly supporting combat operations and the safety of troops on the ground. The young man looked fascinated. Do you work alone or is there a whole team? Usually it's a team effort, Sarah explained. For major maintenance, you might have 6 or 8 specialists working on different systems simultaneously. But for emergency repairs, sometimes you're working alone or with just one other person. Tank asked. What's the most challenging repair you've ever done? Sarah paused, her mind going back to a particularly difficult mission. I can't give specifics about location or timing, but we once had an Apache take multiple hits during a combat mission. The pilot managed to bring it back to base, but there was damage to the hydraulic systems, the electrical harness, and one of the engines. How long did something like that take to fix? Normally, that kind of damage would ground an aircraft for days, maybe weeks. But we had intelligence indicating that American forces would need close air support within 24 hours. So we worked through the night, cannibalizing parts from other aircraft, fabricating temporary solutions, doing whatever it took. Tank was hanging on every word. Did you get it flying again? 18 hours later, that Apache was back in the air, providing cover for troops advancing on a hostile position. The pilot told me later that their support made the difference between mission success and potential casualties. Murphy whistled softly, and I thought getting someone's bike ready for a weekend ride was pressure. Sarah looked around at the group of listeners. That's what I mean when I say it's just our job. Someone has to do the technical work that keeps military operations running. I happen to specialize in helicopters. Tank stood up and began pacing, clearly agitated by his own earlier behavior. Sarah, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect that I should have shown from the beginning. What you do, the training you've been through, the responsibility you carry, and I'm standing here questioning whether you know how to diagnose engine noise. You couldn't have known, Sarah replied diplomatically. That's exactly the point, Tank said, turning to face her. I made assumptions based on nothing but my own prejudices. You could have been anyone, a master mechanic, an engineer, a technical expert. And I decided you weren't qualified based purely on what you looked like. The truth of Tank's words hung in the air. Several other people had gathered again as word spread that the woman who had won the bet was actually a military helicopter technician. An older woman in leather riding gear approached the group. Excuse me, are you the one who fixed that Honda? Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. And you work on Apache helicopters? The woman continued. Sarah nodded. The woman extended her hand. Thank you for your service. My son was Army infantry in Afghanistan. He said the air support made all the difference over there. I was just doing my part, Sarah said, shaking the woman's hand. Tank watched this exchange with growing understanding of just how significant Sarah's role really was. She wasn't just a mechanic. She was a critical part of military operations that protected American lives. Sarah, Tank said quietly, would you be willing to let me buy you dinner? Not as an apology, though I definitely owe you one, but because I'd genuinely like to hear more about your experiences. Sarah looked surprised by the invitation. You don't need to do that. I want to, Tank replied sincerely. I learned something important about myself today, and I'd like to learn more about what you do. If you're comfortable talking about it, that is. Sarah considered the offer. Tank's transformation from hostile skeptic to respectful admirer seemed genuine, and she had to admit she was curious about his change in attitude. All right, she said finally, but somewhere quiet. I don't usually discuss work details in crowded places. Tank's face lit up with genuine pleasure. I know just the place. There's a small cafe about 10 minutes from here, family-owned, good food and quiet enough for actual conversation. As the crowd began to disperse, Murphy approached Sarah one more time. You know, you're welcome to come back and help out anytime. Having someone with your skills around would be an honor. I might take you up on that, Sarah replied. I enjoyed working on that Honda. Tank gathered his tools and prepared to leave. His entire demeanor transformed from when he had first arrived at the garage. The arrogant biker who had mocked Sarah's abilities had been replaced by someone who clearly understood the magnitude of his error and the extraordinary nature of Sarah's qualifications. Ready for that dinner? He asked as Sarah cleaned the last of the grease from her hands. The Desert Rose Cafe was exactly what Tank had promised. A small, family-owned restaurant with worn wooden tables and the kind of quiet atmosphere that encouraged real conversation. Sarah and Tank sat across from each other in a corner booth, their earlier confrontation feeling like it had happened weeks ago, rather than just a few hours. Tank studied the woman sitting across from him, still struggling to reconcile his first impressions with the reality of who she was. "I keep thinking about what happened today," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "I don't think I've ever been so completely wrong about someone." "People usually see what they expect to see," Sarah replied, cutting into her chicken sandwich. "It's not necessarily malicious, just human nature." "But it was malicious in my case," Tank insisted. "I wasn't just making assumptions, I was being deliberately dismissive and condescending." "There's a difference." Sarah looked across the table at this man who had undergone such a dramatic transformation in attitude. "What made you change your mind so completely?" "It wasn't just finding out about my job." Tank was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "Watching you work on that Honda was the first wake-up call. You moved like someone who had spent years perfecting your craft. But when I learned what you actually do for a living, it made me realize how much I've been missing because of my own prejudices." "How so?" "I've been dismissive of people my whole life," Tank admitted. "Women, young people, anyone who didn't fit my idea of what a real mechanic looked like. How many times have I missed the chance to learn from someone because I decided they weren't worth listening to?" Sarah sipped her iced tea, impressed by Tank's honesty. "It takes courage to admit that." "Not courage, embarrassment," Tank corrected. "I'm embarrassed by who I was this morning. The way I talked to you, the assumptions I made, the disrespect I showed someone who has done more for this country than I ever will." "Military service isn't the only way to contribute," Sarah said diplomatically. "Everyone has value," Tank smiled ruefully. "You're being generous, but my point stands. You maintain aircraft that protect American soldiers in combat zones. I complain about motorcycle repairs and act like I'm some kind of expert. The contrast is pretty stark." Sarah leaned back in the booth, studying Tank's face. "Can I ask you something? Why was it so important to you to establish dominance in that garage? What were you trying to prove?" Tank considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I think it was insecurity. I've built my whole identity around being the guy who knows motorcycles better than anyone else. When you showed up and clearly knew what you were doing, it threatened that identity. So you tried to tear me down instead of learning from me." "Exactly. And that's what I'm most ashamed of. Instead of being curious or respectful, I went on the attack." Tank shook his head. "My brother would be disgusted with me if he knew how I treated someone with your background." Sarah took another bite of her sandwich, thinking about the conversation. "You know, you're not the first person to react that way. But you might be the first to recognize what you were doing and try to change. Has it been a problem throughout your career?" "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "Military culture is getting better. But there are still people who assume women can't handle technical roles, especially in combat situations. I've learned to let my work speak for itself." Tank nodded thoughtfully. "That's what happened today. Your work spoke volumes, and I finally started listening." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the restaurant owner, a small Hispanic woman in her 60s who recognized Tank as a regular customer. "How's everything tonight, Tank?" she asked, refilling their coffee cups. "Perfect as always, Rosa," Tank replied. "I'd like you to meet Sarah. She's the most skilled mechanic I've ever encountered." Rosa smiled warmly at Sarah. "Another motorcycle enthusiast?" "Not exactly," Sarah said with a slight smile. "I work on helicopters. Military helicopters," Tank added with obvious pride. "Apache attack helicopters, to be specific. She keeps our most advanced combat aircraft flying in places where people are shooting at them." Rosa's expression became serious and respectful. "My nephew served in Afghanistan. He always said the air support saved their lives more than once." She shook Sarah's hand formally. "Thank you for your service." "Just doing my job," Sarah replied, though she was touched by Rosa's reaction. After Rosa left to tend to other customers, Tank continued their conversation. "Do you ever think about what you'll do after the military?" "Sometimes," Sarah said. "I have a few more years on my current enlistment, but eventually I'll transition to civilian life. There are opportunities in aerospace, commercial aviation, even teaching." "You'd be an incredible teacher," Tank said enthusiastically. "After seeing how you approached that Honda repair, watching your systematic thinking and problem-solving skills, students would be lucky to learn from you." Sarah looked surprised by Tank's enthusiasm. "You really think so?" "Absolutely. You have the kind of expertise that can't be taught from textbooks. Real-world experience. Problem-solving under pressure, the ability to diagnose complex problems quickly and accurately. Tank leaned forward. Plus, you have the patience to deal with difficult people as you've demonstrated today. Sarah laughed. You weren't that difficult, just skeptical. I was an ass, Tank corrected bluntly. But you handled it with class and professionalism. That's the mark of a real teacher. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both reflecting on the dramatic events of the day. Finally, Tank spoke again. Sarah, I want you to know that meeting you has changed something fundamental about how I look at people. I'm not going to make the same mistakes again. That's a big commitment, Sarah observed. It's a necessary one. I'm 52 years old, and if I don't change now, I never will. Tank looked directly at Sarah. You've given me a gift today, even though I didn't deserve it. What kind of gift? The chance to become a better person. By handling my ignorance with dignity instead of anger, you showed me what real strength looks like. Sarah felt genuinely moved by Tank's words. I think you're giving me too much credit. I don't think I'm giving you nearly enough, Tank replied seriously. As they finished their meal, Tank insisted on paying the check. It's the least I can do, he said when Sarah protested. Outside the restaurant, they stood beside their vehicles, Tank's massive Harley and Sarah's modest sedan, preparing to say goodbye. Will you be at the rally tomorrow? Tank asked. Probably. Murphy asked me to help out again, and I enjoyed working in the garage. Tank smiled. Good. I'd like to introduce you to some of my friends as the expert mechanic you are, not as... He trailed off, embarrassed. As the woman you thought couldn't tell a wrench from a screwdriver? Sarah finished with amusement. Something like that. Tank extended his hand. Thank you, Sarah. For the lesson in mechanics, the lesson in humility, and the lesson in what real expertise looks like. Sarah shook his hand firmly. Thank you for dinner and for being willing to change your mind. As they went their separate ways, both carried with them the memory of an encounter that had challenged assumptions and created unexpected understanding. Tank had learned that expertise comes in many forms and that respect should be earned through observation, not assumption. Sarah had been reminded that even the most prejudiced people could change when confronted with reality and given the chance to grow. The next morning, Tank would arrive at Murphy's garage early, eager to learn more about motorcycle repair from anyone willing to teach, regardless of what they looked like or whether they fit his preconceptions. And Sarah would continue her work, both military and civilian, secure in the knowledge that competence and dedication eventually overcome ignorance and bias. It had been an unlikely friendship born from conflict, but it would endure long after the motorcycle rally ended, and both returned to their regular lives.